thank you so much for joining us today. We are really excited to have you on. Antwan is the CEO of DataJocks. Really cool background in both sports and in tech and data science. So I'm really excited to hear a lot of your perspective on this whole idea of neurotraining and how data will play a role in sports in the future. But first off, let's hear a little bit about yourself. I do want to hear, how did you end up as CEO of DataJocks? And tell us a little bit about that path and journey that you went on to get there.
Oh man, absolutely. Yeah, so I started DataJocks back in 2018, really with the vision of partnering with sports organizations to help them better understand their athletes, right? When you think about the X's and O's and the plays, there's really a lot built into that, right? There's a lot of things that happens behind the scenes in order to truly enable that success that you typically see on the field, right? And so I wanted to be a part of that process and really help accelerate just a lot of just the day-to-day. It's funny how we arrived at starting DataJocks, man. I'd spent the last 14 years really partnering with the Fortune 100 healthcare organizations and helping them really manage and really maximize their data. So when you think about healthcare and members, you think about healthy days, right? How often that they're going to the hospital or having some event, right? And so what I was tasked with at most healthcare organizations was really helping build that story around members and the things, their journey, their day-to-day, and really help enable them to live healthier lives, right? And then I came to this realization that I could do this with sports organizations, right? And so DataJocks was
using that data to help them live better, perform better, be better. Okay. So that's data in healthcare. And I imagine that that's a pretty cutting edge area in terms of them being on the cusp of looking at data and analytics and seeing, the trends. How does that compare to what you've seen in sports and the importance of data and where we're at now and how that is different?
That's a great point. Just as I've seen in healthcare, it's a maturity process, right? Different organizations are much further along in terms of how they analyze, how much data, and how they're using that data. And we essentially try to meet an organization where they are, right? They're early in kind of that integrating of that data, just getting their general reporting, right? We try to help them build that foundation, right? And from there, once we help them build that foundation, we can move into much more advanced things, right? The AI injury risk monitoring, assessments, may it be physical or cognitive, right? So it's understanding where they are and it's critical.
Yeah, and being able to fit, where they're at because you have all these organizations at different points.
Absolutely.
So you come in and you see these organizations and some are here, some are there. Tell us a little bit about what you're actually doing with this data and how it's helping. You just talked there about like injury prevention, I think. Mm-hmm. Just tell us some of those examples of what are the ways that athletes see this help them.
Yeah, so when you think about the day-to-day of an athlete, right, typically starts 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, right? If we're talking, guys, high school or college, right? And even some of the pro guys that like to get in a little bit earlier, man. But I think it's critical to be able to gather some of that subjective information, right? How they feel, how they slept, right? Yeah. Because if you don't have that understanding and you go in and say, hey, we're gonna do exercise X, Y, and Z, it's a good chance you could potentially end up hurting the guy, right?
You don't know what absolutely
you're actually at, right? So if you grab that subjective info, right, and then let's say they may be using force plates, right? You're pulling that force plate information, right? So when you're able to marry all of that up together, it really better helps tell that story.
Interesting. So with like force plates, for example, what Or let's say, do you work particularly in a common sport? Is it football? Or,
Yeah, we put a lot of focus on football.
So just as an example, let's take a college football program, and you're working with some of the quarterbacks, wide receivers. What would be some of the first questions you're asking them to come up with this plan, and what might that plan look like depending on the answers?
That's a great point, right? When we talk about these profiles, you need to know his history, right? You need to understand that baseline, right? Because that foundation, understanding of where he's come from and what he's been through will help really lay the groundwork for future state, right?
Yes.
When you talk
previous
about
injuries, their current conditioning level.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so if there's a guy that he has a history of ankle injuries, right? Or, he may be, and the other thing that's emerging, and we can talk about that later, is he may be a high stress guy, right?
Oh, yeah.
He typically doesn't handle, unusual events well. So that, I think that's a big part of now, in sports organizations, you really have to understand your guys, right? Because you never know what their triggers are, right? And the better that you understand them, you're able to monitor, all of their various triggers, you're really going to better position them for success.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, let's switch a little bit to the cognitive side, and that ties on, it's like you just said there's this psychology piece to it that you need to make sure you're understanding, is this athlete someone who's typically very high stress, and that's going to be a big factor. How do you see the brain, I'll leave it at the brain, very broad, how does that fit into sports performance and athletics overall?
Man, I see that as
big
being
question, I know.
Huge question, but I see that being more and more important. When you kind of think about the fundamentals, let's just say we're talking football here. Let's just, one of my favorite positions, I'm a former defensive lineman, but let's just consider a linebacker, right? Now he's processing, that the breakdown of a play, right? Yeah. Let's say it's a 3rd and 5 scenario, right? You see the receiver go out in motion, right? You see the fullback make an adjustment off of that. All of those components are really about processing. He's now looking at the whole field and based on what he's seeing now, he's prepping. Okay, I got my pre-snap reads, right? Now he's ready to go, right? And imagine, right, if you're able to train that, accelerate how he's processing, what's happening on the field real time, right? And so by having cognitive training, you're able to now simulate, some of those situations, right? Where now you're able to actually build that in, and he's able to process things much faster. And that's where I see where the game is going. You start to play a lot more games. Yeah. That really preps him from a perspective of what's going to happen on the field, right? Yeah. And it better positions him for now success, because now he's prepped to be able to handle that. He has better peripheral, right? And he's going to react faster because he's now has this prep work prior to just to gain more practice.
Yeah. Now there's in this realm of like we'll call it neuroscience and athletics, there's 2 broad categories. One of them is assessment, which is taking a snapshot and understanding where their current cognitive skills are, what's their reaction time, what's their peripheral vision abilities, things like that. And then there's the training piece of it. For DataJocks and what you've seen in your experience, how do you balance those 2? Are you doing more of an assessment to understand their existing cognitive state to then be able to come up and work on training plans? Or do you focus more on the training side, thinking about these skills as trainable and improvable, where that's got more emphasis in the longer picture of focusing on training?
Yeah, I really see both as being critical, right? You have to understand where he's at in order to truly implement a program that makes sense.
And to know if it's working.
Right?
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? And so without having that initial assessment and baseline, right, it's going to be much harder to really build out a personalized program, right, that fits that guy, right? I think I think that's the evolution of what we've seen in sports. Is it used to be, just very general, right?
Yeah.
Each individual athlete's different, and now that's even more important that we build out a personalized program that makes sense for that particular athlete, right? Because you really want him to really be the best guy that he can be, and that's not possible if you're just giving him, the Joe Blow, workout.
Yeah.
Right.
Standard template.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, something that I thought was really interesting was as we were actually getting set up here and situated, we were talking and it came up the idea of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs in athletics. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And I want to hear, you say a little bit more on that of you're working with an athlete. Mm-hmm. It's like you don't want to do cognitive training if they have yet to do strength training.
Oh man.
Tell us more about just that, what does that pyramid look like?
That, and that, I would almost say that's emerging culture, right? Like when you think about, and we'll continue to build on football, when you think about just the general nature of football, in terms of the preparation, right? Off-season conditioning, the strength and conditioning program has been, really monumental, right? And it's gained even more importance, right? But it's evolving, right? Yeah. Where it used to be strictly strength and conditioning, now it's strength and conditioning and nutrition, right? Every day, every year, organizations are realizing that there's more pieces to this puzzle, right? And we need to continue to add high value capabilities that's really going to support the athletes and success, right? And so it continues to evolve. So now it's strength and conditioning, right? And like I said, it's nutrition. And now we see the cognitive component, right? And, obviously I have my own opinion, but my opinion, these two should coexist and almost be equal, right? I think today it's probably a 95 to 5%, but I believe things need to continue to shift, right? Where it's almost 50-50. I don't know if it'll ever really get there.
What would 50-50 look like? Is that, still spending a lot of time in the weight room, but making sure that athletes and coaches are really emphasizing and taking time to focus on meditation, on cognitive training, on what's a 50-50 split look like?
Yeah, my opinion needs to be integrated into the weight room. It has to be integrated into the weight room. It has to be a part of that daily regimen, right? Just as you would go in and you have your session, right? Somewhere along the line, you need to have probably 20 minutes out of that 60 minutes or, have that cognitive aspect built into your workout. Because absolutely, right? And making certain that guys are primed and ready to go, right? And I think as that becomes more of the norm, you're going to start to see more and more benefits of it.
I'm curious that, you talk about it becoming the norm. What would you say is the current state of how coaches in particular view this idea? I'm sure you would get a broad range of reactions if you tell a coach, I think we should be doing a 50-50 split between cognitive, some sure, some no. What is the current state? What do you think, generally, is the overall mindset of coaches? And do you see that changing? Is it becoming more? I imagine, that they're recognizing the importance of it.
Absolutely. I think what you're seeing from the Simone Biles and some of the other, premier athletes, right? And now it's forcing everyone to kind of think about kind of that mental and that cognitive aspect. Yeah. It's forcing people to rethink kind of their overall regimen, right? Yeah. And by having those type of influences, right, wise counsel and advisory boards are now saying, okay, maybe it's time we revisit our frameworks and how we develop the overall programs, but it's a process and it's going to take time. It's getting folks accustomed and really believing in it, right? And so I continue to believe that I see in the next 3 to 5 years, this is going to become more common. Just as we, guys, we talk about a power clean or hang clean, deadlift and bench, right? That cognitive aspect will continue to grow as just as important.
Yeah. Well, Reflection, of course, being in the same space, I think I've seen also just a overall shift, even in the last few years, of people already beginning to recognize and see the importance of this value. And I think the Simone Biles example is a perfect case of very recently, the mental side getting national attention and recognition. But we work with a lot of different types of programs, actually, and I wanted to show you a video that we recently did about some of our other customers and users, their perspective and input on strength training. So I want to show you that, and actually then hear some of your reactions, if you agree, if you think, if there's any points you'd change, stuff like that. So let's take a look here for a second.
Oh, we could fly.
So Neuro-Training, right? Why is it so important?
It's important to realize that the top level drivers in the world use cognitive training as part of their program.
It is the hidden competitive advantage that athletes are not tapping into. What we are trying to do is give them this competitive edge in their ability to react quicker, to think faster.
If you're not taking advantage of that same area of expertise, you're shortchanging your goal.
The visual, especially for a race car driver, it's extremely important, right? It's how you train your eyes to react to things that happens in front of you. Since we introduced reflection, those reaction times is definitely what you do when you're fighting a car, either in a wet condition or a car that you have your hands full. I love it. I love it.
Your brain's like everything else, it becomes fatigued. What I'm looking at doing is making people so they're still sharp later in the fight and they can still make the better choices. And this is where the edge comes in perfect.
It really addresses the skills that a lot of coaches call the intangibles. We are seeing so many visual cues as athletes. Really, the edge is the bridge between the visual skills, the brain and processing, as well as adding the physical skills that they need to perform.
Our mission here at PitFit is to make the driver safer and improve their performance.
To help you harness the power of the brain.
To bring neurotraining to the world for every athlete and give them every advantage.
All right, so that's some of what our customers are saying, and there's a couple points I want to talk about in there, but just generally, would you agree with a lot of what they were saying and the sentiment across?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll go back to my linebacker scenario, man. People don't understand the difference between an average linebacker or an average defensive lineman or just an average football player versus the guy he's a game changer, right? What people are starting to realize is his cognitive ability, right? I think, when you think about Tom Brady, it's really started folks to kind of see things different, right? Tom was a guy, he wasn't physically gifted, right? But when you look at Tom and you think about what he's done, across his time in the NFL, it's pretty significant, right? And in my opinion, what he did at Tampa Bay it sealed everything. Like, man, I gotta call him the GOAT, man.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I would concur. Yeah, after Tampa Bay, he's clearly a general on the field in many ways, and that cognitive piece is huge. So one of the points that was brought up was around fatigue, and I'm curious to hear, as fatigue starts to set in, you're getting fourth quarter of the game, things are, national championships on the line. What starts to fade sooner? Is it the physical aspect or is it the mental?
My opinion is the mental.
Interesting.
Right? It's the mental. And that's where, when you think about winning championships, that mental toughness, right, becomes critical. I will admit, from my playing days, I pretty much, yes, I physically took advantage of a guy, but we were pretty much physically equal. It many times became, I mentally wore him down as well. And when that happens, Now, right, he's mentally tapped, physically, right? That's the next thing to go.
Yeah. If you think it's, I completely agree. If you think it's the mental that's one of the first to go, why do you think coaches don't recognize that as much and aren't able as to see it? Because, you would think that, yes, that's true. So coaches would want to be focusing more on mental. What do you think a coach who isn't as much a believer in neurotraining, what do you think their argument against that is, or their side of it?
Well, you're obviously fighting time and what people are accustomed to, right? I think what we're now getting to a point is you're now able to quantify, one's cognitive capabilities to where before it was something, it was qualitative, right? We're now getting to a point where we can quantify one's cognitive capabilities, right? And it's now further validating why this should be something that gets higher priority in terms of the overall training regimen.
Right. And I could see, a coach looking at someone on the sidelines and they're hunched over, they're breathing hard, they're they show physical exhaustion, and the coach would see that but not piece together the mental aspect of it contributing to their decreased performance. But as you said, now we actually have a way to measure some of that, and we can better tell that that's really one of the first things to go, and that's going to have a bigger overall impact on their performance during the game. Well, another point that was brought up for the video was the analogy to strength training, or honestly, overall, I would want to hear, how do you think this concept of neuro and mental training, how is that analogous to other types of training, and maybe even the way that other types of training have evolved through the years? Like, not everyone was always doing strength training at a certain point. If you were a soccer player, you weren't focusing on that, but now just about everybody does. Can you make any analogies to how the neuro side might play out and how it looks like other ways that people are more familiar with?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think just as on the strength and conditioning side, when people started to see the numbers, right? When people started to see, hey, they probably should make certain they're in the weight room a certain amount of time, right? When you think about injury prevention and that overall program, it kind of bumped up in priority, right? The value of what that off-season, training program, does, right? The same thing that I believe is going to happen from a cognitive perspective as more and more information becomes readily available. It's talked about more in conferences. When more and more research and outcomes become more prevalent, I foresee and I predict that this is going to increase how it's integrated into the day-to-day performance training of athletes.
Yeah, I had put another way, it all comes back to that data.
Absolutely.
People saw what strength training was doing to athlete performance, and it was, wow, why are we not doing this?
Absolutely.
And I can absolutely see the same type of path following on the neuro side. Okay, so in athlete performance overall, what do you think is the lowest hanging fruit at the moment for the average performer or player to be able to improve? Do you think is it in pure reaction time? Is it in their peripheral vision? Is it their ability to focus in on a specific play, a game? What do you think if talking to the rest of the athletes out there who might be watching this, what would be your recommendation on an area to focus on first?
Yeah, when you think about it, I would definitely say reaction time. Because obviously, if you are in place, you're going to be much better off, right? A lot of the emphasis, especially as you move more to the pro level, it's the detail, right?
Yeah.
It's a lot of the emphasis is putting on footwork, right? And footwork is really reaction time, right? Because if you're in better place, you're much likely going to be able to make the play.
Yeah.
Either that may be offensively or defensively, right? So if you can improve one's reaction time, I will put a high level of probability that you're going to improve the outcome of their performance.
Yeah.
Right. So just from my perspective.
Yeah. Well, I would say that as well. That is true. My answer would probably be the focusing in on a play, of making sure that you're fully in the moment of what you're doing. And I'm just thinking about, I was an ice hockey player. That was my sport. And that is a very, you're on the ice giving everything you got for 60 seconds, then you're off the ice, 60 seconds back on. So it's this big transition or frequent transition. And I have noticed that the more time that I spend mentally preparing and thinking about the game when I'm on the bench between those shifts, I'll go out there and do much better as opposed to if I just sit on the bench and am, catching my breath and waiting for the next guy to come off. So I've been putting more emphasis into that myself, or trying to think about that just in the beer hockey league I play now. Still having fun with it, a great sport. But going back to DataJocks, that's really what I wanted to end on, and hear a little more about your grand vision for, we'll just say DataJocks specifically, and this ecosystem that I know you're trying to build behind it. Mm-hmm. A few years from now, where do you see that? What do you see that looking like? Paint a bit of a picture for us.
Yeah, great question. Right. So one of the areas we started to engage with organizations, high school, college, we started to see that there was some gaps, right? We talk about, a lot of our software and analytics that we offer, right? We started to realize that they needed a place, right? They needed a home, right? They needed to somewhere they can gather all the information, right? And then we layer on all these different capabilities. And from our perspective, what we see is we're building an ecosystem for DataJocks, right? So we want our community to sit in the core, right? The athlete, right? When you think about everything that we do, it's all about the athlete, right? And so we want to build that community, right? And then from there, we layer on what we call kind of like our other capabilities, so our software and analytics. Hey, let's talk about the data. Let's aggregate all of that, right? And then we have the application aspect, right? The performance lab aspect, right? But obviously, with every athlete, in order for them to even make it, right, to the next level, people have to see them, right? And that's kind of what we kind of view as that recruiting aspect. So we're building what we call almost like a triangle, right? To be able to truly be able to support athletes.
Yeah, it starts with the athlete, that's got to be at the center. And even from just the way data works in all of this, it's a very growing system, in the sense that the more people join, the more powerful of a tool it becomes, the more people it helps bringing more people in.
Correct.
So I can see that flow playing out of using more and more data to make smarter analytics, smarter choices for these athletes, and better decisions. So, that covers a lot of what we wanted to spend time on. Is there anything else that you're thinking about, or you think is a big part of this neurocognitive realm that we haven't touched on yet?
I don't, man. When we first met, a year or so ago, man, I was really stoked about, the technology. It has not let me down, right? You guys are continuing to evolve, really what you guys are doing. And from our perspective, we see it being a continued part of our overall offerings to our community. And we're just super excited, right? Because we recognize that the future of, really sports science and sports is not only, the physical, but it is that cognitive side, right? That mental. And so we're really elated to be able to offer that, partner with organizations, and to help them better understand, how they can really take things to the next level when they take advantage of both.
Yep, absolutely. And something I realized early on is that the way this space is evolving, I think we all need to work together to really make it something powerful. And the more that we can do that to help each other out and learn about what's working in different places, the more it spreads, and then the more growth you see in that. And so I'm really glad, though, that you've been happy with Reflection, and I'm excited to keep working with you moving forward. It's got a lot of promise, I think. But overall, Antwan, I really appreciate you joining us here for our podcast. This is one of our first, so you're an awesome guest to have. Any final words as we wrap up here?
Oh no, just look out, man. We're got a lot of exciting things coming down the pipeline over the next 6 to 12 months. This is an exciting time for the company and where we're taking things, man. So just look out.
Good deal. Well, Antwan, thank you. Everybody, thank you for watching. Appreciate it. And don't forget to tune in next time.